Hello, good evening. I know it's quite late. It's the last day in July. And let me tell you, if you still hear my voice, it's because there's still smoke in the air. And it was like 31 degrees Celsius, which is like, almost 90? I know people going, well, no, I'm living in a place where it's 110. I'm going, keep it. I am not a hot weather girl. So I'm going to do two video recordings of Indigenous people, and I think it has a lot to do and a good observation of what's happening within Alberta or just in the world in general when it comes to systemic racism and white supremacy, and especially things that happen in the States compound our experience in Canada. Why is that so important? Again, because, the Native Americans, United States, made treaty with the U.S. government and how their constitution was set up. Whereas Indigenous people, Métis and Inuit, and First Nations, those treaties were set up with the Crown, which is not like the Prime Minister or Premiers. It's not the same. So before I go on in terms of these two TikToks, I want to thank all my listeners, especially the ones who've been visiting my blog. Oh my goodness, skyrocketing to, I've never had that many people tune into what I've had to say. Thank you. And I hope Terry and Marie are listening. Hello. Anyway, I know there are probably more people, but I really appreciate the attention because it's noteworthy. This is something historical that's happening, as well as the insight into complacency. Now, I am a senior, and I go gambling once a month when I get my pension. And I usually meet a lot of other women pensioners. So I'm going to relay what I experienced last night. I met this lady. She came to me, and we were sitting next to each other, and she says, I live in a nursing home. So we sat there playing throughout the evening, and then she disclosed to me, we were talking, I don't know how, of course, we go into healthy human sexuality, and then she says, I've never known any other man. She says, I'm really naive when it comes to human, male sexuality. And so I basically had to school her in certain parts of male anatomy and female anatomy. And then she gives me this ugly face, and she says, the old men in the nursing home are horny. She just can't, it's just like she's there to escape these horny old men in nursing homes. And, I can't, I have my own home. I don't know what it's like to live with strangers in a little communal institution where the men are, think that they have some right over women's bodies. Again, as we age and the attitude we have about human sexuality lingers right into when you become an elder. So that's why I talk about healthy human sexuality and how important it is to talk about it, especially as we're aging and the things that we need to heal with or from. The other lady that I met, she's rents in the city because her granddaughter has disabilities. And she was commenting on how much she gets as a pensioner, as well as the foster care system, because she comes from Siksika, which is an hour east of here. And so we made a conversation about how many foster children were from within Siksika that are in foster care, and that the average age for children that are being trafficked is 14. Then I made a comment too, even there's a bill being passed, S61 or 62, or just S2. I can't remember what it is, but it's going through to change a section of the Indian Act. Now, for all those who are unfamiliar with the Indian Act, it's law. It has prevented all these hundreds of years, well, since its inception in the late 1800s, we had to obey them, and we still do. Okay, so there's a law that's going to change to get so that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis will have sovereignty over their children. This is in the year 2026, people. Let that sink in. When you have all these separatists saying, "Oh, the society's so unjust," get off the cross. We need the wood to build a sweat so we can heal ourselves. That's a joke. And the lady, she says, my husband and I dress up as Santa Claus for Christmas, and we go and visit the communities that bring all the foster kids together. And she said, I wish our leadership would come to these gatherings of our foster children. She says, it's so sad. Because they're not in their home community. It's like Indian residential school. They're not in their home community. They're being raised by mostly immigrants who don't understand the history of genocide, or people who are just systemically racist. So the children are sad. Now, for me, bear with me, okay? Like I said, I'm a senior. I'm an elder. I've lived my life, and I was talking to a friend of mine since I've known since childhood. I was talking about again, healthy human sexuality and how men sort of focus on Indigenous females as something erotic and something to create a fantasy about. But at the same time too, there's also this dichotomy or diversity or we'll call it paradox or juxtaposition. I don't know, but I'm trying to give a metaphor here of how and why Indigenous women are attracted to certain types of white men as well, or certain types of men. It's because our Indigenous men have been raised to be really tough. And so, we're not afraid of the exterior of, men who appear to be really tough-looking men. And usually, in my case, how I found out was when I met a draft dodger from Vietnam, a U.S. deserter from California, years and decades ago. But I've noticed that in terms of how comfortable I am around certain types of men who I think a lot of women would be really scared of. I'm just saying, no, you have a reason to be afraid of some men, because some men are really bad. But at the same time, too, not all men are horny old men, too. So that's the reason why, when I talk about the dance of intimacy between male and female and putting boundaries down is vital, because I don't think sometimes, in terms of this one lady who's living in a nursing home, I don't think she has community, say for me as an Indigenous woman, I have community. Whereas, I think a lot of times, like I said, when you've lived within a society where the patriarch thinks that women should serve them, and then what happens when the male partner passes away? The female is looking for somebody to give them to take care of, to mother, or whatever role they took in terms of patriarchy. And the fact is, when your estrogen and all this change has happened, you are no longer complacent, and you want to be heard and seen. Again, unless you have the support system in place, it's important. It's also important to just get out and howl at the moon once in a while, which for me, I do that once a month. But that being the case too, there are some senior women and men who just, it's really difficult. And anyway, in terms of mental health, that's just my mental health observation for this podcast. Okay, now the two records, or the things that I want to share with you on my podcast, has to do with how people perceive Indigenous people in just in the sense of when people are talking, especially when I'm giving a talk about systemic racism or just people in my community. So the first one is of two men talking about something that they posted in social media, and the second one is going to be of a Lakota lawyer who was instrumental in Standing Rock that happened in 2013, 2012, and he's a lawyer, so he's going to give a parallel in terms of sovereignty and treaty rights, which has a lot to do with what's happening in Alberta right now. So, but the first one, I'll play it, and then I'll do a little comment afterwards. But again,
I had a clip that went viral because I said, we are not conquered, right? I'm not a conquered person, and what I was referring to was every time the Indigenous people win something in court, some land or some treaty, you read the comments and it's like, you fuckers were conquered, you guys we slapped the shit out of you and took everything. And all I was saying was, we're still here, we ain't been conquered, you weren't slapped around shit, we were slapping you guys around just as bad, so... And the fucking comments went nuts.
I know
the video went viral, and it was so hurtful and hateful what they were saying, and racism was so alive. And then somebody said, not modern day Canadians are like this. And I said, yes, they are. Read the comments.
that is absolutely laughable because, like, it's not only just online. It's like, man, I don't know how settler Canada can live with themselves, knowing that they literally destroyed other people and their lives and their homes and their communities and still just go on about like it's nothing, and not only that, it's like they cannot stand to see us feeling good or just being healthy. And then all of a sudden there's white guys in there, well, why don't you go drink another beer then? Why don't you have some more beer? Like, we can't even just be.
It's funny, like when you talk to a non-Indigenous person, they go and they're some. My coworkers were appalled by some stuff that was said to me at work, and they're just like, and then I got my best friend's Indigenous.
I hate that shit, man.
I'm gonna flip the script and say a lot of my best friends are white people. Guys that I grew up with, Scottish, and just Finnish, whatever.
Yeah.
And I always tell my Finnish buddy, I was like, "You're so colonized, you don't even know your own language, your own culture." But anyways, that's another story. I had a clip that went viral because I said, we are not conquered, right? I'm not a conquered person, and what I was referring to was every time the Indigenous people win something in court, some land or some treaty, you read the comments and it's like, you fuckers were conquered, you guys we slapped the shit out of you and took everything. And all I was saying was, we're still here, we ain't been conquered, you weren't slapped around shit, we were slapping you guys around just as bad, so... And the fucking comments went nuts.
I know
the video went viral, and it was so hurtful and hateful what they were saying, and racism was so alive. And then somebody said, not modern day Canadians are like this. And I said, yes, they are. Read the comments.
that is.
See, and that's the whole point, too, of my podcast, is young people have been experiencing this, and they're talking about it on social media. But in my generation, there was no social media. We had to basically hitchhike to different protests and get together as young people and walk down center roads in some small racist town, demanding that people take notice of there's no drinking water for the school. Or sit in and say, like, we're not getting your fiduciary obligation to the medicine chest for education or health isn't. You're claiming it's empty when it shouldn't be because of our treaty rights. Now, this next one is regarding treaty rights.
What is being described, what was described by Senator Dibble, is a declaration of war on American people, on American families. What we are facing is an insurrection and an attempted overthrow of constitutional order. When we take a look back as American Indians, we committed ourselves to the United States of America. We signed treaties with the United States.
See, so when he's saying Native American, he's a Sioux, Lakota. Now, I'm using this as a parallel because this is the same thing Indigenous people, that's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, have been saying. We've signed treaty with the king, the crown, not a president, not a governor, not the prime minister of Canada or a premier of Alberta. It's the crown Indigenous people are. So even though he's talking about insurrection, it is in the sense of what's happening with separation.
And we swore to defend the United States of America.
See, my father was a World War II veteran, World War I. Like, Indigenous people they didn't have to serve in the military, But what this lawyer is saying, like, we swore to defend, and that's like the highest amount of people who enlist are Indigenous people, because we're defending the country, like in the United States, defending the country that they signed treaty with. Okay, so this treaty does mean something because it has to do with sovereignty. Okay.
The United States of America, forever. So as an attorney, as a human being, as a father, as a husband, when I see the integrity and the sanctity of the United States Constitution being overrun outside the scope of the law.
See, and this is what Daniel Smith is doing. When you have people, leadership, seeing, like, going outside of the scope and what he's talking about. Now, it's a generalization, but it's a parallel exactly of what is happening when it comes to separatists, or the way separatist people are thinking today. My opinion.
Outside the scope of constitutional authority, I have to ask myself, what am I willing to give? What am I willing to give to make sure that our people, the good people of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota, and the United States and tribal nations.
See, this is the whole point. Not just in Sutina, not just in Treaty 7, not just in Treaty 6 and 8. We're talking about all the treaties in Canada. What is it that we're going to give? What is it that we're going to do? And this again too, I want to reiterate this. When I say you have a pot to piss in, that has to do with treaty. Everything, like the first treaty that was signed by the United States was called the Jay Treaty, which declared them a country. Okay, and that allowed Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, to cross the medicine line, the United States line, without immigration, without papers, because they acknowledged that Canada was a country, British colony, that had Native Americans who were the first peoples within this continent. Okay, so I'll continue with what this lawyer says.
St. Paul and Minnesota and the United States and tribal nations. What are we willing to give to ensure that we have the right to speak freely? This is the gravity and the weight and the magnitude of a very live controversy, a constitutional crisis that is disturbing the peace of all Minnesotans.
See, in this Constitution, what Daniel Smith is trying to do is is disrupting all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. So it's not only just happening in Canada, it's happening in the United States. And every time it happens in the United States, I tell you, they do not have sovereignty. They do not have the third largest monarchy in the world, the oldest. They have a fresh new country that's 250 years old. Okay, so again, what is it? What is it that that we're trying to say is, because it's treaty, and because there are so many Indigenous people in the world, and because of all the genocide that's been happening, it has to take precedent over what people are trying to say or do when it comes to taking away our very sovereignty.
Right now, this is no small matter. And like the 19th generation keeper of the sacred white buffalo calf pipe, Orville Looking Horse says, it is no accident that you were born into this time, that you chose to incarnate spiritually here, in this realm, in this plane. And my heart goes out to you, because you have upon your shoulders, and you have the commitment of tribal nations who've already banned ICE from tribal lands and have said in a lawful manner that we will not contend with the illegalities and the criminal seizure of constitutional order. Everything that they're accusing the good people of Minnesota for violating is being done by those that we trust to uphold law and order. But what is being described, what was described by Senator Dibble, is a declaration of war on American people, on American families. What we are facing is an insurrection and an attempted overthrow of constitutional order. When we take a look back as American Indians, we committed ourselves to the United States of America. We signed treaties with the United States of America, and we swore to defend the United States of America forever. So as an attorney, as a human being, as a father, as a husband, when I see the integrity and the sanctity of the United States Constitution being overrun outside the scope of the law, outside the scope of constitutional authority, I have to ask myself, what am I willing to give? What am I willing to give to make sure that our people, the good people of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota, and the United States and tribal nations, what are we willing to give to ensure that we have the right to speak freely? This is the gravity and the weight and the magnitude of a very live controversy, a constitutional crisis that is disturbing the peace of all Minnesotans right now. This is no small matter. And like the 19th generation keeper of the sacred white buffalo calf pipe, Orville Looking Horse, says, it is no accident that you were born into this time, that you chose to incarnate spiritually here, in this realm, in this plane. And my heart goes out to you, because you have upon your shoulders, and you have the commitment of tribal nations who've already banned ICE from tribal lands and have said in a lawful manner that we will not contend with the illegalities and the criminal seizure of constitutional order. Everything that they're accusing the good people of Minnesota for violating is being done by those that we trust to uphold law and order. But what is being described, what was described by Senator...
So, like, I want you to understand, too, that when it comes to sovereignty, and even when, say, different provinces or states, for that matter, want to extract oil or put a pipeline through without having the Indigenous people involved, it goes against the treaty right. Okay, so they had this huge 10,000 people from around the world camped in Standing Rock in the Dakotas. Because, again, they had Wounded Knee when I was a young woman. The standoff in Alcatraz. The American Indian movement when the FBI and the agencies chased the activists into Canada. And how we opened our doors to our brothers and sisters across the medicine line. So when we're talking about a crisis here, I don't think Daniel Smith, this lawyer Roth, or Sam Mereshi, and all the cohorts who are part of this spider web that this Spider Woman has webbed throughout the government of Alberta, changing the very foundation of a fiduciary obligation at the federal level that Indigenous people in Canada have been governed by. I use the example of Nietzsche Institute. My mother went to residential school when she was 5. Yes, all the problems that she had. You know, we talk about hypersexuality, we talk about limerence, we're talking about all these disorders, everything. We talk about this recovery center where, you know, people think, in Sudan, my son's going to go there. And I'm going, are you kidding me? There are 11 centers that are going to be in Canada, or Alberta, to privatize our health. 11 centers, 3 are for Indigenous communities. I said, and those 11 are supposed to look after 2,000 Albertans? I said, where in your mind do you think First Nations are going to go? I said, when we have a population of 10 million in Alberta. I said, the fiduciary obligation was really difficult to even get and use federal money to develop and design mental health structures through Nietzsche Institute. My mother was one of the first that was trained in the community. There was a high dropout rate. Again, because the obligation was at a federal level and the paper trail my mother had to do in reporting, in budgeting. In the province, you don't do that. But because it's a federal fiduciary obligation, my mother got trained and she did it. And the fact that they were doing this to help all First Nations in Alberta and even other people who came to Nietzsche Institute. Do you know, too, that Nietzsche, before being shut down by Sam Mareshi and Daniel Smith at the pandemic, that they had curriculum for children who were aging out of the foster care system? When we talk about children's rights, and everybody go, oh, murdered and missing, and they go, oh, well, they just don't know how to take care of their children. No, we've been here thousands, 20, 10, I don't even know if people who actually have come into Canada, like United States is 250 years old. I think Canada is 100 and something. I'm 74. That means people who came into Canada when Canada was a country could have been 74 years old when I was born. That's how young it is. And you have the audacity to think that the Indigenous people didn't know how to live. And you took away all our rights under the law, structured under a name called the Indian Act. A lot of young people are using so much to educate other Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. But Nietzsche Institute tried to do this with Indigenous people, elders, their peers, to educate on mental health. Because we had to have a spiritual component with it. So when this lawyer, Chase Arnaiz, or I think it's, sorry.
What is being described?
Chase Arnaiz, yes. When he is talking about, we came here at this time, at this level, for a reason. We incarnated at this time, at this place, at this level, for a purpose. Now we have to, that's why I advocate in terms of just the common bonds as human beings we have. And how a lot of times the misunderstanding of what matriarchy and patriarchy is, as well in terms of what mental health is. So that, when you're growing old and you all of a sudden you cannot function and you have to be put in a nursing home, that you're not running around yelling on the top of your voice, I need sex. And the only thing that will cure you is that your sons bring in laptops so you can watch porn. If that works in terms of your mental stability when you're a senior, hey, I'm not gonna argue the point. It works. Helps a person understand their own healthy sexuality. But it's important to talk. And I enjoy talking to women because there's so much as women, by the time they become older, have so... I laugh because I know it's a nervous laugh, because what can you do? People chose to live a certain way, and because of that, they didn't have the capacity or didn't have the intuition or the know-withal or wherewithal to learn about their bodies. Sometimes the conversation I have is do you know where the G-spot is in the man, or do you know where the G-spot is in the woman? Just the whole notion of how disgusted they are to be around other people who, are so used to, usually, how do I put it? Usually this type of lifestyle is in somebody's home, privacy of their home, their bedroom. But when you get older and you have to live in the communal living and you haven't your entire life, then there is a problem. And for me, what I say when I say about Indigenous people, especially when you've lived in community, you've lived in communal life your whole life. You've lived collectively and holistically. And so a lot of times I shouldn't say a lot of times, I do believe the more we practice and the more we say things and try to get people to understand like what a fiduciary obligation is. Because it's a treaty. It's a treaty. With the United States, when he's talking about constitutional law, in Canada it's the Indian Act, as well as the Constitution. So we have this law, the Indian Act, and like I said, there are two parts of the Act that are trying to be changed this year. This is in 2026. They closed the industrial schools in the early 1900s, and then they closed the Indian residential school in the 70s. They gave, I think, Indigenous women the right to marry whoever the hell they wanted to, in the 80s or 90s? It isn't until the 70s women were allowed to have a credit card or buy a home? That's a white woman. And the fact that Indigenous women, we lost our status. We were told we weren't Indigenous anymore. Like what a shock. Especially when you have a white husband who is, taking on the responsibility to educate, Indigenous woman who's never grown up around white people, what it is to be white. See, I don't have that. I don't. I've never had it. Knock on wood that I came into this life in a community that is right next door to white people. So I've been around white people my entire life. Hey, you want to know how different I am? Spend a couple of days with me. I'm just grateful that one white man did, and that he got a taste of what it's like to be with an Indigenous woman who is quite opinionated. And again, too, maybe in some strange position or some strange attitude, like the safety of like looking at me and like wondering, what is it that I see in terms of sexuality or why I'm attracted to him. It's because Indigenous men have had a tough life. When I was in my early 20s, my late friend, she came from up north, an isolated Indigenous community, and she went to residential school, had all the things that happened in residential school, was married to a very violent man, and when she separated from her partner, from who she married into Sutina, we were friends for over 30 years, I got to know her siblings. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because she had one brother who was like 6'5". I swear, if anybody saw him come walking into a bar, you'd think Sasquatch just walked into the tavern or the nightclub or whatever the hell. I mean, he was a monster. And the reality of it is like, I knew like just sitting there in his presence, there is no way anybody's going to come around me or try to mansplain me, boss me around, manipulate me, whatever. Like, and I didn't know this. It was just like, it was just restful and peaceful, socializing with him in public. Well, that's the way it was too with this white man who followed me down to Las Vegas, and it didn't really, click, because for me being handicapped, I have to always plan ahead, like the timeline. I got this much time to do this and this and this. I mean, everybody does that too, but for me, it's taken a while to just sort of decompress and sort of reflect and, okay, what just happened? And so, I do things ritualistically, like I do things in ceremony and through ritual and prayer and gift giving, as well as with meals and all. It's a whole ceremonial thing. And I don't expect to go into terms with it, but the reality of it is like a lot of things that I try and teach about spirituality is after each acknowledgement of another human being, it's always an embrace or a release with Creator and grandfathers and grandmothers' will being done. And if that's the case in terms of letting go of people I just met and releasing them, that's part of life. It's like birth and death. You come and you go. So in hindsight, when I look at my traveling with this white man, I thought, oh, it's because he's white. But the last time I traveled with a white man was from Utah to Canada, and it was decades ago, and the guy was so racist. We drove 16 hours. He was so infuriated. We hit a deer in Idaho. He didn't even stop to check about the damage in the car. He just wanted to get the hell away from me, get me home as soon as possible. And I've grown up with white boys like that my whole life. Like I said, I've been around white people my entire life. Just the name calling, like those two men in the earlier social media clip that I played. It's one thing. It's one thing when you make a statement and you have all hell break loose because, oh my goodness, you're talking about racist. I'm not racist, they'll say, and yet they are. So it's no biggie. It's no biggie. It's just part of life. But again, too, I want to reflect back on the comment that the reality is all over the world there are individuals who've gone through so much, so much trauma. I'd rather use the word trauma than hell and heaven, because with trauma you're just talking about trauma. You're not talking about good or bad. It's trauma, and how they've managed to find balance in their lives in terms of healthy human sexuality. That's important. And so for me, following like him coming with me to Las Vegas and then just seeing people, how they saw me interact with him, was the same way my friend's brother, like how people saw me with him, the Sasquatch of a man, okay? Like he just didn't want to mess with me because here's my bodyguard. And that's how I felt. And it didn't really click until like now it's May, June, July, like 3 months going on 4. And I realized, no, I think the energy that I was feeling was that of protection. So that when people saw us together, it was just like, oh, it's like when I look back at it and I'm thinking, oh, are these how millionaires or celebrities feel when they're in public and people are staring at them and they have bodyguards and entourage with them, knowing that, if somebody approaches me, they'll step in and intervene. Like that's what this I call him Wachashtawashte, which in Dakota means good man. Like that's what he did for me. And it's very rare, like I said, I go into the city or I go places as an Indigenous woman and as an elder. And it's very rare to find a white man who would step in like that, to bring in that same energy as my friend's brothers did. And they were huge, strong Cree men. So that's why when I say he doesn't realize just the gift that he's given me and the fact that he had no, how would I put it? He didn't see color. Like I the only way I could explain it is when I was in high school, I met a lady who had sight for the first 2 months of her life as a baby, and they had to remove her eyes or she wouldn't live. And so when I met her in high school, we got along because she didn't see color, and she told me one time, she says, Marina, and again, this is what this Chase Arnaiz is talking about. We chose to come here at this time. And my friend Lori says, Marina, she said, you're going to be famous someday. And I couldn't understand her concept of what she saw as famous. I was just a young woman in my early 20s, in high school. But it was I think it has to do with energy and, just what we've come here to this life to do and live. So whoever I influence in whatever way that sways them in whatever direction, that's important for me. And like my late friend says, Marina, you haven't hurt anybody. People would sooner try to hurt somebody because they're jealous or they see something they don't understand. And if I can give help to people understand what it is to be under the Indian Act, what law is at the federal fiduciary level, which I know for a lot of people who pay taxes in the province, don't understand that because they're under provincial system, which to me I don't understand. I mean, I go into school and I go into town, pay taxes and all that stuff. So I understand that much, but I don't understand. Like, I know how much money my sister has to pay for like just living, like taxes and utilities and stuff like that. It's not like the 40,000 Indigenous people in Calgary are living on the streets. My goodness, they're working, they're functioning people. So wake up, Daniel Smith. The ancestors, the grandfathers and grandmothers who worked and prayed to help their descendants. We are still actively doing this. We've been doing this for thousands of years before we were even colonized. And with that gift, it keeps on going because it's not ours. Somebody said something about ant piles, and I use that as an analogy. And if you've never flowed with a group of people in a crowd, and you want to get out of it, you can't, because the crowd has its own energy. So with that's the whole nature of what's been happening, I believe, in my opinion, since the discover and since the bombing of the atomic bomb. And good, people were wondering, well, how are we going to live with it? Well, this is it. We're at this point. Like I said, my ancestors for thousands of years knew that any moment this existence that we're living on could be destroyed, just because of the vastness of where we live, and the fact that we use ceremony and ritual to talk about it and to live it, and then now today, when there's so many thousands of atomic bombs, and it just takes a few to explode in one place for it to be equivalent to a huge asteroid hitting the Earth. And now, look at the climate. What have we done? How are we going to save this for our legacy and our children? And who's steering? Who's doing the manipulation and who's moving? We can't fight it. We have to let go. We have to embrace it. Then we have to release what we've been thinking that we have control or a say over when we don't. This is Creator and grandfathers and grandmothers' will being done. If you have any hardness or trauma towards me, that's fine. I have no say over that. If I offended anybody, it wasn't intentional. And at the same time, I'm doing the best I can in trying to educate people of what it's like to be an elder Indigenous woman who's grown up in matriarchy, around lateral violence, around systemic racism, who's educated, who sees women differently than other, like, say, white women see other women. I know that. I've grown up, like I said, my whole life around white people. And at the same time, too, there are so many things, interesting things about other women from other cultures, from other parts of the world, that make life worth living in understanding how they function as women within their culture and their society, because we're all different. And my hope is that white fragility doesn't destroy all the work that the women have done to maintain their freedom, but with fascism the way it is within white women, they're doing it to themselves. And what else could I say? It bothers me that there's this religiosity, we'll say, or ideology of being the healer. Because why you functioned in white society, being an individual, when there's a crisis happening right now where we have to embrace the collective and the holistic approach, and we have to release all those independent ways of thinking in order to bear witness to what's evolving, not as human beings, but as a living organism on this planet, just like every living organism. Okay, I wanted to put that out there. I'm just really grateful that I've been trying to understand my own mental health and my struggle in the sense of finding balance in terms of, like, say, addiction with gambling. I do it once a month. I don't do it every day or every week. And again, I really didn't, I've never grown up like that. The same thing with alcohol and drugs. My whole life, I can count how many times I've drank at parties. And again, too, even when I say I have a bit of autism, on the spectrum, the fact that I haven't been sexually active, and I know how many partners I've had in my life, but yet at the same time I can talk about healthy human sexuality, because it's interesting in the sense of looking at men and how they function in the bodies that they have, because I can't comprehend like how if it's amazing. I mean, all the science and patriarchy is all centered around men, hospitals, lawyers, law, all that. So for me, when I talk about patriarchy, I'm going, yeah, I know, but at the same time too, I just see the facade, the suit, and I know there's more happening deeper in there. But at the same time, I'm going, no, I'm just grateful that Creator, the grandfathers and grandmothers, have blessed me with the ability to feel comfortable around very dangerous men, and that I've been protected by Creator and the grandfathers and grandmothers. Some people, whatever they want to conjure up in the sense of what is a healer or what is a spiritual person. Again, you do what you want to do and say what you want to say, and stand up on your pedestal and say, I've done this and this and this. That's okay. That's not what my podcast is about. My podcast is there to raise the alarm that our children are falling through the cracks. Like I was telling my cousin just half an hour ago, I said, all this I discovered by advocating for my niece, for advocating for my nieces and nephews, and for taking care of my elderly mother, who was in residential school since age 5, and to have a close relationship with her siblings because I took care of her. So those things for me as an elder now, I started, I took that position a long time ago when I moved back from the States. I had opportunities to go and live in Hong Kong or Taiwan. Just like I lived in the United States, I lived in another country. There was nothing stopping me from living in Hong Kong, except I knew that my mother needed me. I didn't know how much I needed her. I didn't know how much I needed my community and the people I grew up since childhood to learn about life. So with that, I'm just totally grateful for all these young people that I know in my community that are thriving, that are open and honest. And what can I say? I'm just so grateful. And I want, non-Indigenous people to understand this, because they have this stereotype that it's so horrible to live in Indigenous, Métis, or First Nations communities. It's because you're looking at me with rose-colored glasses. When I look at you, I don't have those glasses on. When I see people, they don't see that I can see their trauma, only because I was raised around it in a very, it would look like a really harsh character environment. But that environment was very loving to me. And I honor it by talking about the dismantling of all the hard work of the grandfathers and grandmothers who came before me, all because of this separatist movement, all because of a country, United States of America, and Russia, trying to get access to the oil that's in Mother Earth. The very milk that Mother Earth has, the very foundation of the water within what she lives, is what we've lived on, and to wean us from that. Wean us from that so Mother Earth can die. Like again, I apologize to the Creator, grandfathers and grandmothers, because as human beings, we can die off. Mother Earth has been around even before we existed, and she'll remain a living entity even when we're gone. So I hope you understand the concepts of what I'm trying to say, because as we live and age, there'll be a point where we all leave. But acknowledge the reason why you chose to live at this time and at this place, and what is it that you will do to make sure that this same way of life continues. Anyway, so much for that. So again, I appreciate the fact that I can do a podcast and put it out there. And I appreciate all the invisible helping hands. And those invisible helping hands who came forward, made themselves visible to me. What can I say? You love people when they come into your life. And then you let them go. And that's the beauty of life. Wo pidal midakya piya wasana. Creator, grandfathers and grandmothers, thy will be done.